Shalom, friends. Welcome to the Shir in Talmud. We're studying Masechet Berachot, Tractate Blessings, and we're using the Koren Talmud Bavli edition, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz. As you can see, a very beautiful edition in front of us. We have the original Hebrew Aramaic text. We have the translation. We have notes and biographies and diagrams and illustrations. All of this is there to help us find our way through the Gemara that we're studying. So please do follow along with me. And while I'm talking, feel free to read the notes on the side. If there's something that is not clear or I'm not making clear enough for you, please read along with me. I'm Eliyahu Shir from Chesed Ve'emet. You can find my site on www.lovingkindness.co. So we're on Daf Yud Tet, and we're just starting off Amud Beis. That's page 19, side B. Each page of Gemara consists of two sides. We're on the second side of page number 19. And we're discussing the Mishnah that spoke about various moments with regards to reciting the Kriyat Shema, as to what pertains to when a person is required to say it, when he's not required to say it, so on and so forth. And we're speaking in particular about a situation of attending a funeral and dealing with mourners. And people who go to the funeral and have to deal with the mourners, etc., what is their responsibility in reciting the Kriyat Shema? That's basically what we've been discussing. Those of you who have listened into the previous shiurim would have heard other beautiful ideas that we spoke about. We'd ended off last week's shiur also on the idea of that a person shouldn't open up his mouth to the Satan. One should be careful with what one says so as not to provoke additional judgments against oneself. And even if things are tough and we see that perhaps we're not deserving, we feel to ourselves that perhaps we're not deserving of the best things in the world, that doesn't mean that we need to incite the Satan against us any further. What God does to us in his own way is sufficient. We don't need to ask for additional those things that are not in the area of blessings. We don't need to ask for those type of things in our life and increase on those type of matters. So we're now continuing with the theme of the Kriyat Shema and with regards to the obligation to say it when we are present at a funeral. The Mishnah said the words Ha'omdim bashura, those who are standing in the row, v'chulei, etc. Those who are standing in the row, the interior row. We said those in the interior row are exempt from reciting Shema and others are obligated. Those are in the front are exempt. The others are obligated because those in the front, of course, are taking a real part in the funeral. And those who are at the back are less present. They can say the Kriyat Shema. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught in a Braisa, in a Tosefta here, Shura Haro'a Penima, if we're talking about the row that looks inwards, Petura. They're exempt. They do not have to recite the Kriyat Shema. The people who are standing behind them and they're not looking directly inside, chayevet, they are obligated to recite the Kriyat Shema. Once the time comes about, it's the correct time to recite the Kriyat Shema. Everybody has an obligation to recite the Kriyat Shema. So those people in the front, however, are exempt. They're taking part in this mitzvah of the funeral. Those who are at the back and they can't quite get to see in the front, so they're not really as much a part of this procession as everybody else, and therefore they're exempt. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Habaim, those who are at the back are exempt and those who are in the front are obligated. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Habaim machmas ha'evel, somebody who came for the sake of the mourner, Peturin, those people are exempt. Machmat atzman chayavim, but if they came to the funeral for their own purpose, meaning they weren't there for the sake of the mourning that was taking place, they were just onlookers towards the funeral. Such individuals are obligated to recite the Kriyat Shema. Those who are taking a part are exempt. Those who are just there to be a part of the funeral, but they're obligated. They're not taking as much a part of the funeral as the others. Omar Rav Yehuda, look at this note here. Those who come on account of the bereaved, that we're not there. Sorry, there we are. Those who come on account of the bereaved, Rabbi Yehuda's statement can be interpreted in two ways. One possibility is that Rabbi Yehuda is more stringent with regard to those standing in the first row. If they did not come on account of the bereaved, they are obligated to recite Shema. Alternatively, it is possible that Rabbi Yehuda is more lenient with regard to those in the second row if they came on account of the bereaved. Some say that Rabbi Yehuda is merely explaining the statement of the previous Tana. He distinguishes between those in the first row who are there in deference to the bereaved and those standing in the other rows. Omar Rav Yehuda, Omar Rav said that Rav said, Hamoitze kilayim bebigdol, new subject, somebody who finds kilayim in his garment. That means to say that he finds a forbidden mixture. He finds a mixture in his garment of wool and linen, which is forbidden to wear. And he's walking along and he sees, hold on a second, it seems to me that I'm wearing a garment that has this forbidden mixture. Poshtan afila bashuk. He should take off the garment immediately, even if he's in the marketplace, says the Gemara. He's walking in the marketplace. He notices the label on the garment, or he realizes he is very wise and he knows the different fibers, and he realizes after all, he's wearing wool and linen, the forbidden mixture. He must take it off, even though he's at the marketplace. My timer, the Gemara asks the question, what is the reason that he has to take it off immediately? Wait for him to get home. Isn't it true? We don't want to embarrass him. He's in the middle of the marketplace. It would be inappropriate for him to take off his pants, for example, which are a combination of wool and linen. It would be quite embarrassing. But the Gemara says over here, no, he must take the garments off immediately in the shuk. Why? Because ein chochma ve'ein tvuna ve'ein eitzel leneged Hashem. There is no wisdom and there is no understanding and there is no advice against God. Which means to say, if God says that the garment is dangerous, for example, if a person realized that he was wearing pants that had on them a bomb, and he thought to himself, he could get these pants off quickly and run fast, maybe the bomb won't explode, maybe he could do it, he'd certainly do it. And what about the embarrassment? He would say, what embarrassment is there? I just saved my life. Well, this is the principle that we're speaking about over here. It is a verse that comes from the book of Mishnah, the book of Proverbs, from the wisest man in the world, King Solomon, who said that when it comes to Torah, when it comes to wisdom and understanding and advice, there is nothing when it compares to that belongs to Hashem. If Hashem says that a person who's wearing a forbidden garment should remove it, even if he's in the shuk, he's in the marketplace, immediately he takes it off. It's like a bomb, and he realizes he needs to save his life. Forget about the embarrassment. Kol makom sheyesh chilul Hashem, any place that we find that there's a desecration of God's name, ein cholkim kavod l'rav. We do not give honor to the teacher, which means to say that even in such a situation, we don't want to show respect even to the teacher, which means to say as follows. First of all, I would like to just explain this concept of what's called Chilul Hashem. There are two concepts in serving Hashem. One is called Kiddush Hashem. The other is called Chilul Hashem. A Kiddush Hashem is when we do something that sanctifies God's name. A Chilul Hashem is something which desecrates God's name. It's very interesting to note the concept of the word Chilul. Those people who have looked, for example, at the famous work of the Arizal called the Eitz Chaim, the primary work in the studies of Kabbalah, or one of the most primary works in the studies of Kabbalah, will notice that when God created the world, it says that there was no makom halal, there was no empty place in which God could create a world. And therefore God had to contract himself in such a way as to allow an empty void to be in existence. And it was in the empty void that God then began all of creation. The halal is a place which is devoid of godliness. A Chilul Hashem is an action that we do whereby what we're involved in kind of says that God is not present over there, but God is present everywhere, which means to say that when we're engaged in the action where we are saying, so to speak, that God is not present, that is something out of the question. That is called Chilul Hashem. What is the Chilul Hashem? It's as if to say God is not present. When I speak about the forbidden mixture and I say I'm going to wear it in spite of the fact that God says it is prohibited, it is the Chilul Hashem. What does it mean? It means there's a vacant space. There's something open there, as if to say that God isn't there. God is not watching the fact that I'm wearing a garment that is forbidden. That is what's called Chilul Hashem. So wherever we speak about the concept of Chilul Hashem, we don't even give honor to the teacher. Meisivei, the Gemara raises some contradictions now with regards to this principle that we learned above, where we say that ein chokhmah ve'ein tvuna ve'ein eitzel neged Hashem. There is no wisdom, there is no understanding, and there is no advice by Hashem. Kavru hameis v'chazru. They buried the dead person, and then they returned after the burial. They're walking out the cemetery. V'lifneihem shtei derachim, and in front of them are two paths. Achaz Torah, one path is pure. V'achaz tameah, and one path is impure. Means they go along that path, they're going to find themselves in a path which is not appropriate to walk along. Torah, if the person who is leading the way, in other words, the mourner, is going along the pure path, everybody should follow along in the pure path. But if he takes the impure path, then everybody should follow him in the impure path. And the reason that we do this is because of his honor. Now here above, we learned that we don't even give honor to the teacher. And over here, we're learning a principle that because of the honor due to the mourner, even though he took the impure path, we should follow him along the impure path. Amai, the Gemara asked the question, why do we do that? Leima, say, which means to say, you should say the following. Why would we go along the impure path, which is not in accordance with the Torah? Say, ein chokhmah ve'ein tevuna leneged Hashem. There is no wisdom and there's no understanding against Hashem, which means to say, if Hashem says don't take the impure path, what are you doing walking along the impure path? You say to me, oh, we're going along there because we want to show him honor. But we said we don't even give honor to the teacher when it comes to a Chilul Hashem. If God says no, it is no. He took the impure path. Does that mean I have to take the impure path? And the Gemara says over here, we still go along this way, and he goes along the impure path. Targama Rabbi Abba, the Beis Hapras Drabanan. And Rabbi Abba explains it. He says what the Gemara was referring to here is a case of what's called a Beis Hapras. We're going to learn in a second what is a Beis Hapras, which is only rabbinical in nature. And since it's rabbinical in nature, it was permitted to walk along that path. Let's just look at the notes over here. For example, with regard to a field in which there is a grave that was plowed and no longer intact, the entire field is deemed impure due to concern that the plow scattered bones throughout the field. The field is impure only by rabbinic law, but not according to Torah law. Since it is only prohibited by rabbinic law, one is permitted to walk through the field to show the mourner respect. Take a look at the notes here. He comes on the pure path. The Ravid's version reads, if the community comes on the pure path, the priest comes with them on the pure path. He prefers that version because it explains why the priest does not simply go off on his own, as the mourner would not notice the absence of one individual and therefore would not perceive it as an affront. Rather, it is indifference to the community, as it is inappropriate for one individual to separate himself from the community. So here we'll be speaking, for example, of a situation of a Kohen, for example, who would find himself also, as a result, having to walk along an impure path as well. Beis Hapras. This term is a general term referring to a place in which by rabbinic law, ritual impurity imparted by a corpse is dispersed. So we know the halacha, the general halacha is wherever there's a dead body, that dead body, the body of a Jew that is present somewhere, imparts impurity. And the Kohen must be very careful not to find himself in that area because there's an impurity that will be imparted to him and it's forbidden for him to be there. Now, this Beit HaPras is a problem. Because what's going on over here is that there were bones, and what happened was something happened. They were plowing the field, and the bones got scattered everywhere. Now, as a result of this, we regard this area as being an impure area. But this is only by rabbinic law. Typically, it refers to a field in which a grave was plowed, causing the bones to be scattered throughout the field. A second field that falls into this category is one where it is known that there is a grave, but its exact location is unknown. The third field in this category is one where it was customary to place the bier while the deceased was eulogized. The concern is that limbs might have fallen in the field and remained there. But the whole thing is that since the space Hapras, we don't know exactly what's happening over there. It has a bit of uncertainty to it. Therefore, it only fits into the category of a rabbinical law. And therefore, what we were speaking about over here, where they were going along the impure path, it was speaking about the Beit HaPras, which is impure only on a rabbinical level. And for this sake, the rabbi said we don't have to apply the Torah principle of Ein Chochma ve'Ein Tuvuna leneged Hashem, and the person may walk along that path. Beit Pras, the language, there are several interpretations of this term. Some hold that it stems from the Hebrew prisa, meaning spreading or expansion, i.e. a field in which the ritual impurity is spread throughout the entire field. Others suggest that it stems from the fact that a broken or sliced parus, source of ritual impurity, was found in the field. Yet others maintain that the field is given that name because people's feet, parsot, do not tread there. Another school of thought holds that the name is foreign in origin. Some say that it's from the Latin form or from the Greek, the Latin form, or from the Greek paros, meaning in front of. And let's just finish this page, and then we'll read the halakha. To Omar Rav Yehuda, Omar Shmuel, that Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, Mina peyach adam beis hapras v'holech. A person may blow on the land, on the soil of the beis hapras, of this ground, and he may continue to walk. As a result of his blowing all the time, he's scattering the possibility that there might be something there, some bones and he's now blowing it out the way. And as he begins to walk, he never actually walks over anything that is forbidden, anything that's impure. Rav Yehuda bar Ashi mishmei de Rav, Rav Yehuda, the son of Rav Ashi, said in the name of Rav, Beis haprash shenidash tahor. A beis hapras that has been trodden on is in fact pure, and therefore we don't have to worry, no longer need be concerned about bones. Clearly, the entire prohibition is a stringency decreed by the sages. Let us take a look at the various halachot relating to the section that we're currently reading. Those standing in the row of consolers, those in the interior row who are face to face with the mourners are exempt from reciting Shema, and those in the exterior rows who are not face to face with the mourners are obligated to recite it in accordance with our Mishnah and the Tosefta here. One who discovers diverse kinds in his garments, kilayim, also known as shatnez, as many people call it shatnez, other people refer to it as kilayim, forbidden mixtures. One who discovers a mixture of wool and linen prohibited by Torah law in the garments of another person must remove the garment from him. He must do so even if they are in the marketplace with no concern for the affront to his dignity. Even if the individual in question was his teacher, as the dignity of a rabbi does not override the dignity of heaven. So there they are, they're walking through the shuk, and the pupil notices that the rabbi is wearing a garment that is forbidden. It contains both wool and linen. He should take it off the rabbi immediately. If the mixture was only prohibited by rabbinic law, he may wait until the person wearing the garment returns home before removing it from him, as per the Gemara's conclusion that rabbinic decrees do not override human dignity. Furthermore, if the individual had worn the garment unwittingly, even if the mixture was prohibited by Torah law, human dignity takes precedence, and he should not remove the garment from him. So these are very strong halachot, and of course we have to be very careful with it. We really have to know what we're talking about before we go ahead and simply embarrass people along the way. We need to know exactly what the situation is. Consoling the mourners in a Beit HaPras. A priest may enter a field in which a grave was plowed in order to console a mourner who is there. A Beit HaPras that has been trodden underfoot, one who has passed through a field in which a grave was plowed and a path had already been trodden, is ritually pure and ineligible to offer the paschal lamb. Similarly, if as he was passing through he blew the dirt before him and did not encounter a bone capable of rendering him ritually impure, he is ritually pure and eligible to offer the paschal lamb. The sages did not apply their decree in a case involving karet. Let us continue. Tashma, come in here. The Gemara is going to give us another proof about this concept of ein chochma, ein tuvuna, etc. The Omar Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Tzadok, said the following. Now, he, of course, was a Kohen. And he says, Medalkin hayinu al gabe aronot shel meisim likras malchei Yisrael. What we used to do is we used to jump over the coffins of the dead in order to go and greet the kings of the Jewish people. That's what we used to do, he says. V'lo likras malchei Yisrael bilvad amru, And it wasn't only if a person was doing this for the sake of greeting the kings of the Jewish people only did they say this. Even if we were going to visit, we're simply going to greet the kings of the nations of the world. Even then, we could jump over the coffins. And we know, of course, that this coffin is going to impart some sort of impurity. So how can the Kohanim jump over all of these coffins? What is the reason that he's allowed to do it even for the non-Jewish kings? The reason that we can jump over and be in line to possibly becoming impure for the sake of the non-Jewish kings, that's ridiculous. But it's important. Why? Because if he merits it, because he'll be able to make a distinction. He will distinguish between the kings of the Jewish people and the kings of the nations of the world, which means to say that if he has the merit to meet the non-Jewish kings, he will be able to start learning how does a non-Jewish king work and how does a Jewish king work. He will learn the difference between the two, whatever that should mean, of course. But the main principle is that as a result, he will gain in his knowledge. He will understand the ways that the non-Jewish kings rule their provinces. He will understand the ways that the Jewish kings rule their provinces. And this will, of course, help him throughout his life in understanding politics and different ways of rulership and so on and so forth. Why is he allowed to do this? Jumping over these coffins, whether we're speaking about for the sake of the Jewish kings, whether we're speaking about the sake of the non-Jewish kings. Lema, say, that there is no wisdom and there's no understanding and there's no advice against Hashem, which means if Hashem says, don't do it because it could impart an impurity, why are we taking such a chance and making up stories? Just don't do it in the first instance. If the Torah gives a command not to do something, don't make up in your head what you can do and you know better and so on and so forth. You don't know better. The Torah is telling us what the correct thing is. Now, according to Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzadok, he's telling us a story that as a Kohen, what he would do is he'd jump over the coffins, let alone. He was a great man. He certainly realized what the Torah was, and he took it with his own, in his own way. He just said to himself, I'm going to take this opportunity. I'm going to jump over these coffins. Kida Rava. This is like Rava. To Omar Rava, because Rava said the following. Dvar Torah, Ohel, when we speak about the Torah mitzvah of a tent, of course, is a place which encloses and surrounds the dead body. Anywhere where there is an opening of a tefach, which means approximately just under 10 centimeters worth of empty space, this makes a separation between the tumah, which means to say if a person is buried in the coffin acts as an ohel, as a tent surrounding the dead person. And as long as there is an empty space of at least a tefach, which means a fist, which means just slightly less than 10 centimeters, so then, of course, the tumah will be captured within the coffin area and will not escape outwards. And if it doesn't have the measurements of this tefach, of this less than 10 centimeters, this fist, this amount of the fist, then it would not be considered to be a separation from the tumah that is spreading upwards, as we see over here, and the pressed ritual impurity can reach the heavens. So he continues, V'rov aronot, when you speak about the majority of coffins, yesh bahen halal tefach, they do indeed have an opening from the dead person towards the opening to the top of the coffin. They have the amount of empty space of tefach. The gazru, and the rabbis decreed, al sheyesh bahen mishum she'ein bahem. They decreed of all of them on account of those that don't have, which means even those that do have the separation of the tefach, the rabbis decreed even on those, don't jump over those coffins on account of those that do not have the tefach, because you've got to be careful of those that don't have the tefach. But when we speak about the honor of kings, the rabbis did not decree for that purpose, which means to say kavod habriot, kavod melachim, the honor due to people, the honor due to kings, so long as it wasn't a full mitzvah d'oraisa that we're speaking about, a strong, powerful Torah mitzvah. So at that point in time, for the sake of the honor of people, the rabbis were a lot more lenient. Let us take a look at these notes here. The coffins, the aronot, the ossuary is made of stone as its cover. We see this is how they used to bury. They had this type of a coffin that looked like this. We see this is from the Second Temple era, and it had an opening, obviously, between the dead person and the top of the coffin of a tefach, so you could be certain that as a concept of ohel, that this contained the full impurity within it, not allowing the impurity to escape any higher. He says here, we would jump over the coffins of the deceased. A priest is permitted to run to greet the kings of Israel and disregard rabbinic decrees of impurity. Whether or not this allowance applies to Gentile kings as well, see the Rambam and Magen Avraham over there in these various places. Let us continue inside. Tashma, come in here. I'll give you another proof that this principle of Ein Chochma v'Ein Tuvuna, it doesn't always apply. Gadol kavod habrios, great is the honor of people, of creatures. Shedeiche es lo ta'aseh shebetorah, the honor of people can even push aside a negative mitzvah of the Torah, which means that if the Torah says that thou shalt not do X, Y, and Z, but in the event that as a result of not doing X, Y, and Z, it will cause a tremendous embarrassment to somebody, comes out that the honor of people is greater, and therefore it pushes aside the negative mitzvah of the Torah. V'amai, the Gemara asks the same question yet again. Lema, say the following. Ein chochma v'ein tuvuna v'ein eitza neneged Hashem. There is no wisdom, there is no understanding, and there is no counsel, advice against Hashem, which means to say, how could the rabbis even say a statement at all? That great, so great is the honor of people that it pushes aside a negative mitzvah of the Torah. Targama Rav Bar Shaba Kamei de Rav Kahana. So Rav, the son of Shaba, explained in front of Rav Kahana, belav as a negative de lo tasur. He said that applies to lo tasur. What do you mean lo tasur? Do not deviate. We read the notes over here. We read the end of the pasuk in the Torah. It says over there, you, according to the Torah taught to you and the ruling handed down to you, you shall do. You shall not deviate to the left or the right from which they tell you. This mitzvah in the Torah is a command upon the Jewish people that whatever the rabbis teach should be done or should not be done, must be done or not done. Which means to say, at this point in time, the Torah gives permission for the rabbi to give a halakhic ruling. And when the rabbi gives the halakhic ruling, we must be careful to understand that that is coming from a Torah source. It is not just a private opinion that some fellow, well, you know what, he was studying in the Kollel for a few years, and somebody came to ask him a shaila, and he asked a question, and the rabbi answered, you shall do X, Y, Z. And they said to him, oh, who are you to tell me what I shall do and what I shall not do? Well, the mitzvah in the Torah says that what the rabbis say over in their halakhic guidance to us is something that we need to listen to, and we should not deviate to the left or to the right. And as we know, the Rashi tells us over here that even if they tell us left is right and right is left, and they say it the wrong way around, still we have to be careful to listen to their words. After all, if we don't listen to the words of our teachers, and we always mistrust what they're going to say, however will we come to believe them on anything, in which case we won't have a Torah, because who are we going to follow for advice? If we're never going to trust what the rabbis tell us, because we always say, oh, they're just human beings. What do they know? I'll follow the Torah, but they're just telling me their own personal story. Well, this is not true. They have been studying the Torah for many, many years. And if the person had received smicha, he was given the right to be able to rule in halakhic matters, then of course, when he gives over a halakhic ruling, the Torah says you shall not deviate, neither to the left nor to the right, from what it is that he is instructing over. This is the mitzvah of lo tasur, do not deviate. The Gemara continues, achiku alei. So they started laughing at him. Lav de lo tasur do raisehi. This negative mitzvah of lo tasur is a Torah prohibition. It has nothing to do with rabbinical prohibitions that we've been speaking about, that when it comes to a rabbinical prohibition, we can transgress it for the sake of the honor. We're talking about a Torah prohibition. That's different. Omar Rav Kahana. So Rav Kahana said, Gavra Rabba Amar Milta, a great man, has said something. Lo tachiku alei. Don't laugh at him. He knows what he's talking about. Kol milei d'Rabbanon asmechinhu al lav d'lo tasu. All of the matters that are rabbinical in nature are really supported on this negative prohibition of lo tasur. Umishum kavoido sharu rabbanan. And on account of the honor of people, the rabbis permitted various things. Let's just take a look at the note here. That we said, however, due to concern for human dignity, the sages permitted suspension of rabbinic law in cases where the two collide. All rabbinic decrees are predicated on the mitzvah of the Torah to heed the judges in each generation and to never stray from their words. Therefore, when the sages suspend a decree in the interest of preserving human dignity is overriding a Torah prohibition. In any case, it only overrides rabbinic decrees. So that was the end of the conclusion of the whole story, is that ultimately we're talking about when the rabbis do announce that a particular action can be taken, they are only giving that in the case where it gives honor to the person, respect for the person, respect for his dignity, when it relates to a rabbinical mitzvah. When it relates to a Torah mitzvah, then of course we say, Ein chokhmah, the ein tavuna, the ein eitza, l'neged Hashem. There, when it comes to a Torah prescription, then of course we have to be very careful, and the Torah is wiser than we are and knows what is for our good. However, when it comes to various mitzvot that are only rabbinical, inverted commas, only rabbinical in nature, where human dignity is at stake, we override, the rabbis will override the mitzvah that is there, or the aveira, whatever is happening there, and they will decree that on account of human dignity, we can override the rabbinical prescription over here. Let us just see if there are notes here. The prohibition of you shall not deviate, lav d'lo tasur. Some explain that rabbinic decrees are overridden by concern for human dignity, despite the fact that the authority of rabbinic decrees and ordinances is itself based on a mitzvah in the Torah. That mitzvah only requires individuals to obey rulings of the Sanhedrin when there is a dispute between the sages. However, the authority of rabbinic ordinances and decrees is alluded to by this prohibition and not based on it. And that was the conclusion of the discussion that we were saying. Let us continue. Tashma. The Gemara says, come in here. What is it referring to? Something new. With regards to the laws of returning a lost object, it is stated, you shall not see the ox of your brother or his sheep go astray and ignore them. Return them to your brother. Now listen to those words very carefully. You shall not see the ox of your brother or his sheep go astray and ignore them. Return them to your brother. What's the problem with the verse? Every word in the Torah counts. The Berachot explains that the seemingly extraneous expression, and now we continue. This expression, v'hitalamta mehem, and you shall hide yourself away from them. Nobody said it had to say this. Nobody said it says ignore them. The verse could have said, you shall not see the ox of your brother or his sheep go astray. Return them to your brother. Why did the verse include the additional words, v'hitalamta mehem, and you're going to ignore them? Why does the verse say these words? Pa'amim, the reason is because sometimes, she'ata mitaleh mehem, sometimes you are permitted to ignore them. Sometimes you are permitted to hide yourself away, even though somebody else has lost an object. You are allowed to turn your face away and not return the lost object to them, even though there's a mitzvah in the Torah to return lost objects to their owners. Here the Torah says there are times that one may refrain and turn one's face away as if to say, I don't see it, and continue on one's journey and not fulfill this mitzvah. So we see here, sometimes you are permitted to hide from them, and sometimes you are not permitted to hide from them. So the note over here says, in the context in which it appears in the Torah, this phrase does not mean that one has license to ignore a lost object in certain circumstances. However, since the possibility of disregarding a lost object is mentioned, the inference is that this option exists in halakha, even though it is not the standard practice. The sages interpreted it as an allusion to the established halakha that returning of a lost object is not incumbent upon every individual in every case. Fascinating. Let us see what happens. Ha ketzad. How can this be? Give me an example of how it could be that even though the Torah says if somebody lost their object and you happen to find it, you need to return the object back to them. It's a mitzvah. Now the Torah says apparently you're allowed to hide from it. Answer, im haya kohen, if a person was a kohen, vehiba beis hakavarot, and the thing that whatever it is that he needs to return happens to be in the cemetery, which means to say the kohen does not have to run into the cemetery, get the item and return it to its owner. Why not? Because the kohen is not allowed in the cemetery. He's not allowed to make himself impure. Therefore, even though there's a mitzvah to return the lost object, this kohen does not have to go into the cemetery and return the lost object after all. Or, here's another example. Hayazaken, he was an old man. The eina lefi kavoidoi, and it's not in accordance with his honor. What does that mean? It's not in accordance with his honor. It means that in order for him to deal with the lost object, being an elderly man, he is not required to humiliate himself or go an extra mile to make life extremely difficult for himself if he cannot handle dealing with the subject at hand, with the object. In other words, the subject, the object, the particular thing that he needs to deal with to return to the owner could be beneath his dignity for some reason, or it could even be a situation where it's impossible for him to deal with because he's an old person. He cannot bend down correctly. He cannot reach the item. Nobody says he has to go to extra lengths in order to return the item if it will be difficult for him as an elderly person. Here's another example. He had a lot of work to do. Mishel Chaveiro, then his friends, which means to say he's busy working and he notices that somebody's lost something. He's a busy fellow. He's got to take care of the work at hand. First of all, he must be careful. He must remember that his employer happens to be paying him for the job that he's doing. He can't just rush off and go and attend to other matters in the time of the employer who's paying him money for this. And of course, in the event that he has so much work to do that if he takes off for what he's doing, he's not going to be able to complete his work altogether. So therefore, the verse says, and you hide, and you ignore yourself. You hide yourself, or you ignore yourself from the particular object. Am I? The Gemara asks the same question. We're still on the same subject. All right, we moved off this subject very briefly in one particular way, but we're still on the same subject of Lema, say, Ein chochma ve'ein tevuna ve'ein eitzel leneged Hashem. There is no wisdom, and there is no understanding, and there is no counsel, no advice, whatever you want to say, against Hashem. If God says that if you find a lost object, you need to return it to the owner, therefore, what should you do? Who cares that you're old? Who cares if you're the Kohen going to the cemetery? Who cares? At the end of the day, shouldn't you go and fulfill the obligation, the Torah obligation of going ahead and attending to what needs to be attended to? Fulfill the mitzvah and return the lost object at all possible costs. Shiny Hasam. There it's different. What does that mean? Diksiv. Because it's written in a pasuk in the Torah, it says, you ignore yourself from them. You hide yourself from them. Which means to say what? Let us take a look at the English, indicating that under certain circumstances, in other words, that is the reason that these words are mentioned over there, coming to teach me something additional that I would not have learned had the words not been written, that under certain circumstances, one is permitted to disregard a lost object. In that case, there is a biblical directive that creates an exception to the prohibition you may not disregard. So the Gemara says, we found a case in which human dignity overrides a Torah prohibition. The human dignity, of course, related to the elderly person, for example, the person who was working very hard. The Gemara says, V'ligmar mina. If so, let's learn all cases of human dignity from this very idea that we're learning about here. You don't need to give me additional examples. Just tell me this example, and I'll learn everything from here. The Gemara answers, Isura mimamona lo yalfinan. We do not learn out prohibitions from monetary matters. Since these cases dealt with a lost object, which pertain to money issues, therefore we are learning out something that relates to kavod habriot, as relates to the idea of a monetary matter. And we cannot learn out the concept of human dignity when it comes to prohibitions of monetary law, in other words, and the case of the lost object merely entails a monetary loss, unlike other prohibitions. Let us take a look at the halakha. If he was a priest and the lost object is in the cemetery, or if he was an elder and it's beneath his dignity, a priest who sees a lost object in the cemetery is not obligated to tend to its return. An elder for whom it is undignified to handle an object of that kind, even if it belonged to him, is similarly exempt. This halakha also applies to the mitzvah to assist its owner to unload an animal that collapsed under its burden. Here is the next point. Or if he had work to do, one who earns a high salary is concerned that he will lose it if he interrupts his work to tend to a lost object. If he stipulated before the court that he will be reimbursed for any lost wages, he is obligated to return the lost object. If, however, there is no court before which he could make that stipulation, his wages take precedence, as per the Gemara here and in Bava Metzia 30a, see over there. Tashma. Now the Gemara continues on the same idea, new theme. Here it's speaking about the following case. Of course, if we had our Rashi in front of us, we would be able to understand what's going on. We don't have, so what we're looking at now is we need to see it from the notes that we have in front of us in this edition. Come and hear. I'm going to give you something else to think about. What was said in the Torah with regards to the Nazarite? He shall not become impure for his father or his mother or his brother or his sister in their death, for the crown of his God is on his head. Since it was already written with regards to the Nazarite, he shall not come upon a dead body, why is it necessary to elaborate and specify his parents and siblings? Again, he shall not become impure from his father or his mother or his brother or his sister in their death, for the crown of his God is on his head. But already we know from before that, just one verse before, he shall not come upon a dead body. All of those people are certainly dead in any case. What's the difference? And to his sister. Ma Talmud Leimar. What is the Torah coming to teach us? That it says he may not make himself impure even to his sister. Harei, behold, Shaya ulech lishchot et pischo, v'lamol et bano. This Nazir was going off. Remember, the Nazir may not make himself impure to anybody. He may not drink wine. He may not make himself impure. He has various restrictions. That is the oath that he has accepted upon himself. Now, this is what happened to him. He's a Nazir, and he went off to slaughter his Pesach sacrifice offering. And he went off to circumcise his son. The Shema, and he heard, meanwhile, that somebody died. Yachol Yachazor V'yitamei, could be, maybe, that he could return and make himself impure. He goes off and he changes over, even though he had a neder, that he's not going to make himself impure. One might have thought that he could make himself impure, perhaps for the sister. Answer, Amar, so it says, Yachol Yachazor V'yitamei, Amarta lo yitama. So you said over there, no, he may not make himself impure, which means at the end of the day, he needs to continue doing what he has to do, and the death of his relative will not override so significant a mitzvah from the Torah. Yachol could be, Kishem she'eno metamei lahem, maybe just as it is, that he may not impurify himself to these people, kach eno metamei lemeis mitzvah. Maybe also he cannot impurify himself, he cannot make himself impure for the sake of a meis mitzvah. What is a meis mitzvah? A meis mitzvah is a person who died, and another person is walking along the way, and he realizes that there is a dead body. and he realizes nobody is around to take care of this person's burial. This person is called a meis mitzvah, and the person must be buried immediately. To such a degree, you should immediately dig a hole wherever he is and bury him right there and then even. That's the idea of the meis mitzvah. When we see that there's nobody taking care of a dead body, we need to do it ourselves, and we need to do it immediately. Talmud Leimar, the Torah teaches, to his sister, he may not make himself impure. It's to his sister that he may not make himself impure. We continue on Daf Chav Amud Aleph. That's page 20, side A. But he can impurify himself. He does become impure for the sake of the meis mitzvah. Amai, why can he do such a thing? Lema, say, ein chochma ve'ein tevuna ve'ein eitza leneged Hashem. Say, just like we learned before, there is no wisdom and there's no understanding and there's no counsel against Hashem. Which means to say, if God says that the Nazir may not become impure, he may not become impure. How come is it therefore that we say he's allowed to deal with the meis mitzvah? Says the halacha, one is required to attend to the burial of a corpse with no one to bury it and become impure through contact with that corpse. This is true even for a high priest, a Nazarite, and one en route to offer the paschal lamb or circumcise one's son, in accordance with the conclusion of the Braita cited in the Gemara. Shani Hasam, there it's different. Tiksiv, because it's written, Ulachoisoi, and to his sister, from which we derive that although he may not become ritually impure to bury his sister, he must do so for a meis mitzvah. So the Gemara says, well, since you've proven such a wonderful thing, let's prove all our concepts of the honor that is due to others that can simply override all of these mitzvahs. We'll learn it out from the case of the meis mitzvah. Learn it out from here, that the general principle that human dignity takes precedence over all the mitzvahs in the Torah from this case. The Gemara answers, no can do. Sorry, shave, v'al ta'aseh, shaynei. The idea of sit and don't do is a different category altogether. It's different. What does that mean? Engaging in the burial of a meis mitzvah is not actually in contravention of a mitzvah, which means to say you cannot learn the principle of the honor of a person over ruling a mitzvah at hand, because in fact, the burial of a meis, engaging in the burial of a meis mitzvah is not actually in contravention of a mitzvah. And therefore, you can't use it as an example. Rather, what happens is, by doing so, he becomes ritually impure. That's his problem, and is then rendered incapable of fulfilling that mitzvah. We cannot derive a general principle from here that human dignity would also override a Torah prohibition in a case where that prohibition is directly contravened. Let us take a look at the notes. Let us derive from this case, some very strong and complex ideas in the Gemara. The logical flow of the discussion is as follows. The halacha concerning lost objects constitutes a challenge to the principle that preventing desecration of God's name overrides concerns of human dignity. This challenge is in two stages. First, the Gemara cites the Braita as an example that contradicts the principle. The Gemara rejects the challenge by pointing out unique circumstances extant in the case of the Braita. The second stage is more general, since there is one clear case, whatever the reason, where human dignity overrides a mitzvah in the Torah, it can serve as a paradigm from which a general principle can be extrapolated. Employing the hermeneutic principle of analogy, even though the paradigm was derived from a proof unique to that case, once established, it can serve as the basis for a general principle. Therefore, the rejection of the second stage is not based on emphasizing the unique aspect of the specific case, but rather in proving that this case falls into a special category, and consequently, general conclusions may not be drawn. So, in other words, in the cases that we're using over here, because they are so specific to the particular cases that we're dealing with, we cannot use them as overall examples to prove that whenever we come to a case of human dignity, that it can override a Torah principle. These were unique cases that dealt with specific instances, specific variables that allowed us to overcome the concept of the dignity of the person that overruled the prohibition that was involved. And that's where we end off on this concept of where we see that human dignity overrides certainly a rabbinical mitzvah. And when the case comes about that a rabbinical mitzvah should be transgressed rather than cause an embarrassment to people as a result of what one would do at that point in time, cause them embarrassment, one should rather go against the rabbinical prescription in order that we can give honor to the person involved. So important is it that we honor each other, respect each other, and give each other the dignity and honor that each of us deserves. The Gemara continues. Omale Rav Papa Abaye, said Rav Papa to Abaye, new subject. Mashana, what is different? Or what is the reason? Colloquially translated, Mashana. What is different, Rishonim, with regards to the first sages? The Israchesh Lahu Nisa, that miracles would happen to them. Umashana Anan, and what is different in our case, or what is the reason, in other words, for our case? The law Misrachesh Lan Nisa, that we don't really have miracles occurring to us all that often. You know, in the old days, the sages would perform many, many miracles. Well, already at this point in time in the Gemara, in the time of the Gemara, let alone we're speaking 2,000 years later, 1,500 years later, that miracles are certainly less frequent than it was then. But even in those days, they're speaking about how miracles used to occur to the sages just a few decades before, or a couple of hundred years before. Whereas just a little bit later, miracles were not in such, they weren't so common. So this is the question that the Gemara is asking. Maybe you'll say, if you want to say, in other words, that perhaps it's because of their learning, because they learned so much Torah, therefore miracles occur to them. And we today, we don't learn so much Torah. We're not like they are. We don't learn the type of Torah that they do. Can you imagine? Therefore, that is why miracles occurred to them. Bishnei de Rav Yehuda. This is a story. In the years of Rav Yehuda, Kulei Tenuye Benezikin Hava. Everybody was studying the laws of Nezikin. Nezikin, the laws of damages, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra, or perhaps Seder Nezikin, one of the 6 orders of the Mishnayot. There's 6 orders to get through. In the days of Rav Yehuda, and this is before, in other words, they were studying all of Nezikin. Va'anan, he says, but we, Kamas Ninan, Shita Sidrei, we study all 6 sections. We study all 6 sections of Shas, the Shisha, Sidrei, Mishnah. The 6 sections of the Mishnah, of the Talmud. He says, nowadays, we study all 6 sections. But in the days of Rav Yehuda, they studied only Nezikin, which means to say that today, we study a lot more than they studied then. Today, people say the same argument. They say in those days, they might have studied some Talmud, but really, what did they have in comparison to what we have today? Today, everybody's a big Talmid Chacham. Today, we sit and we study Torah day and night. We learn all the different sections of the Torah. Aren't we greater than they were? Well, that's the same question that Rav Papa was addressing to Abaya in this concept that he was saying that in the days of Rav Yehuda, they only studied one section. They knew it well, but they only studied one section. Today, we study all the sections of the Torah. How could it therefore be that miracles occurred to them and they only studied such a little Torah? V'hi hava matei Rav Yehuda b'okatzin, and when Rav Yehuda would arrive at the last tractate of Okatzin, ha'isha shekoveshet yarak bakadeira, a woman who pickles vegetables in the pot, V'amri la, and some say zeisim shikvashan betarpehen tahirim, and olives that they pickled them with the leaves, they're pure. Omar, he would say, Havayas de Rav Shmuel ka chazeina hacha. The discussion between Rav and Shmuel, all the different disputes and the discussion that they had, we see over here. V'anan, and we, kamas ninin ba'okatzin, when we are studying okatzin, tleisar misivasa, we learn 13 different versions of it. He would just say, this is the discussion between Rav and Shmuel that relates to all the different disputes. But he said, we dealt with 13 different versions. Ve'ilu Rav Yehuda. But here's what really happens. When Rav Yehuda, ki have shalif chad misanei, when Rav Yehuda would remove one shoe, meaning to say, when it came for the time that the generation needed rain, and they would begin the process of fasting and preparing and praying to God, the moment that Rav Yehuda would remove one shoe off his foot in a way of showing discomfort, I'm going to cause a type of affliction upon myself, says Rav Yehuda. At that point in time, already, Asay Mitra, the rain would come down. As he would just remove his shoe. He didn't even pray yet. He wasn't even fasting. Nothing. He removed his shoe as a way of afflicting himself, and immediately the rains came down. God answered his prayers. All he had to do was remove his shoe. I mean, that's pretty easy going. Imagine a situation today where we're suffering in a certain way, and what we do is we say, well, I'm going to start afflicting myself. I'm going to start by removing my shoes, and then I'm going to move on to X, Y, and Z. And the moment we remove the shoe, immediately the affliction disappears. Wow, that would be amazing. V'anan, and for us, ka metzarinan nafshin umitzvah ka tzavchinan v'leiste mashkach ban. We afflict our souls and we shout out with all types of prayers and crying to God, and nobody's listening to us. Mean to say God doesn't answer us. Here we are, we're busy afflicting ourselves in all sorts of ways. We're fasting, we're whipping ourselves, we're doing all sorts of things. We're crying out to God. Nothing. God doesn't seem to answer our prayers. How is it that in before, it seems to be that they studied less and they were answered faster? It seems that we study much more today, and yet when we cry out to God, there's no answer. Omar Lay, he answered him, Abaye said to Rav Papa, Havu ka kama'e havu ka masri nafshahu akadushas Hashem. The first sages, they would be moiser nefesh. They would sanctify. They would dedicated to sanctifying. They were giving over their souls. They were completely self-sacrifice. They were involved in self-sacrifice to serving God. They gave over their souls. They sanctified themselves for Kedushas Hashem. The first generations were involved in active sanctification of God's name. We discussed at the beginning of the shir what it means to do Kiddush Hashem and what it means to do Chilul Hashem. Chilul Hashem is where we say, even though there are certain situations that might desecrate God's name, we go ahead and we do it. Well, Kiddush Hashem is when we sanctify God's name. We do something that shows God is there. When we give tzedakah, for example, that's a Kiddush Hashem. We show that God is present. There is a person who lacks, but I am going to show God's presence by giving this person something, and that shows that God is really there. Anan, lo masrinan nafshin akadushas Hashem. But we do not give over our souls. We do not do self-sacrifice for the sake of sanctifying God's name. There's a story. The story says that Rav Ada, the son of Ahava, he saw a particular non-Jewish lady, and she was wearing a particular cloak, b'shukah, in the marketplace. He was walking along, Machane Yehuda Shuk, and as he's walking down, he saw that there was this non-Jewish lady But he didn't know that, of course, at the time. And she was wearing this particular garment. Some people say this karbalta is a fancy garment, very immodest in its appearance. And he didn't like the fact that this person was wearing it. And it's not appropriate for the ladies to walk around in immodest garments. And some people say it was a garment of shatnez. He knew that there was shatnez in the garment. And we learned before already that when it comes to shatnez, especially when it's a Torah shatnez mitzvah, then ein chokhmah v'ein tevuna. We don't speak about our own wisdom here. Nothing goes against God. If God says it's asur, it's asur. So he sees this lady walking in the marketplace, B'shuka. Savar, he held, Tvas Yisrael he, that she was Jewish. He thought she was Jewish. Kam kra'ei mina. He got up and he tore it off her. Very good. He showed his self-sacrifice by saying, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to the honor of God, people shouldn't walk around in shatnez. Therefore, he pulled it off her. Iglai milta. The thing became known, the kotiti, that she was actually a non-Jew. Well, a non-Jew is entitled to wear shatnez. He did a terrible thing. He even embarrassed her in the marketplace. But what was he doing it for? He was doing it because he wanted to sanctify God's name, because she was wearing shatnez. And he thought, being Jewish, he's going to sanctify God's name by the fact that if he removes it, people will recognize wearing shatnez is a bad thing. So he removes it from her, and he finds out later that she was a non-Jew. The rabbis made an estimation of 400 zuzim that he was penalized for, got a penalty, and he had to pay her back 400 zuzim, a lot of money. He had to pay a lot of money for embarrassing her. Omala, he said to her, as is the way of the sages, they have this unique sense of humor about them. Mashmech, what is your name? He said to her. Amarale, she said to him, Matun, my name is Matun. Amala, he said to her, a play on words, Matun, Matun. Matun, Matun, he's calling her by her name. Arba ma'a zuzay shavya. You are worth 400 zuzim. That was his play on words. What's the play on words? Matun, Matun in Aramaic means 200, 200. So her name was Matun, which means 200. So he said, 200, 200? You are worth 400 zuz, which means to say he was saying to her, your greatness is you are worth the 400 zuz. I must certainly pay it to you. I have shown you disrespect, and I will certainly pay this money to you. And so he gave over the money. But the point of the matter of the story is the fact that he was willing to sanctify God's name. This was the nature of the sages of before, that they were willing to do acts so much for their love of God or their jealousy, that everything should be done correctly, that they wanted to say, shatnez is something that is not done, and they were willing to take that risk even if it would cost 400 shekels, even if they lose out. If they're going to lose out and be ashamed themselves, then all the better, because they want things to be done in the right way, and they are willing to take that risk. Today, of course, we don't take such risks. People should not behave in such a behavior, of course, unless they know exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it. But the point is, in those days, they did behave in that way. They were willing to be involved in the concept of self-sacrifice for the sake of Kiddush Hashem, which today's times people are more reluctant to do. Today we try to keep to ourselves. We don't want to criticize somebody, lest it will be that we'll be found bad in their eyes and all sorts of things. We don't want to really speak out about many things that are very bad in the world, whereas in those days they were willing to speak about it. We've reached the end of the shiur. One or two notes that we didn't cover yet. We'll have to do it in the next shiur as soon as we begin, and then we'll continue the story in more detail as we continue this same type of theme of the various things that the rabbis were involved in, and so on and so forth. Thanks very much for joining me. I'm Eliyahu Sher from Chesed Ve'emet. My site can be found on www.lovingkindness.co. And if you've enjoyed this shiur, please do like my shiur by clicking on the thumbs up button below the video. You'll be helping to support my channel. Please do subscribe to my channel. Again, you're supporting my channel by subscribing. Please do click on the bell button to be notified of future shiurim, which you can tune in to and watch. And again, we'll be supporting this channel and everything that I'm involved in over here. Please feel free to make a comment if you'd like, and I'd be happy to respond and discuss anything that we're discussing on the page. Torah, life, growth, as pertains to what we're learning, or if it doesn't pertain, send me an email via my website, and I'd be delighted to be in touch with you, and we can discuss all these matters together. So if you have got something out of it and enjoyed the shiur, learned even just one thing, let me know what you've learned. Tell me your thoughts, your questions, your insights, and I'd be happy to be in touch with you and make a connection. Thanks very much for joining me, and I look forward to another shiur in the near future. I wish you everything of the best. Shalom, shalom. Bye-bye.